I was, that's a funny picture. All right, we're not talking about mermaids this morning. That's what that picture makes me think of. But we are talking about racism and militarism and materialism. We're still talking about racism and militarism and materialism. I remember I was 16 years old when the war in Iraq, the war that we started after September 11th, broke out. And I remember leaving school with the rest of my classmates, being a good Berkeley teenager, to go protest the war in the streets of San Francisco. I remember blocking intersections and the moment when the horses were coming, cops on horses, to break us up in the streets of San Francisco. It was such a weird moment, and chanting, 1, 2, 3, 4, horses don't support the war. 5, 6, 7, 8, learn from animals, they don't hate. Spontaneous protest. And then the moment when it seemed like we could go and block the bridge, and the motorcycle cops who came and shoved the front of their motorcycle in between our legs as we tried to hold firm arm to arm. But the main memory I have of that moment is when nothing happened after. When the news reported that the most people around the world had protested the outbreak of war that had ever taken to the streets, all united by communication technologies to take to the streets in the same way, and yet our voices seemed to land on deaf ears. And so I've been wrestling ever since, and with a question that the peace theorist and facilitator John Paul Lederach, he's a Mennonite teacher, and we'll talk lots more about him another time, but he says that he starts every graduate seminar in his peace studies program at Eastern Mennonite University with the same question. He says, the question is, how does social change actually happen? And so today, for me, is about taking that great sphere of impact, that great sphere of concern, that great sphere that of everything that I care about and want to do something about, and pulling myself inward towards that sphere of influence, what I can actually do something about. Lederach says, over the years, I have come to intuit more than scientifically prove, to feel more than quantify, that the center of building sustainable justice and peace is the quality and nature of people's relationships. That it's about the quality and nature of relationship, which is, of course, what we do here, why we come here. And when I ask people, why do they come here? Why do you make this effort on Sunday morning when, you could be out hiking in Tilden Park or all number of other good things? What I hear over and over again is community, these relationships. And I sometimes hear it said like this, that I come because I want to gather with a community of like-minded people. And while I certainly appreciate that longing, that desire to be among friends in a safe place where I'm not crazy, there's other people who see the world like I do, I have a hard time squaring it with our conviction that this faith is about the belief that we do not need to think alike to love alike. We attribute that to the early Unitarian Francis David in Transylvania, but it's this sentiment that we still hold. We need not think alike to love alike. We need to be safe enough to pull down the mask, to let go of the ruby, to be real with one another, safe enough to build real relationships that allow us to explore the depths of our lives. And yet I worry more about the risks of being too safe. There's a story that lives among us, I think, and even if we wouldn't, articulate it as such, it's a story that lives subconsciously or maybe in our bones, that it is what we have in common that gives us safety and belonging. At its most basic level, it's actually about how our brains operate, how they learn to categorize, as demonstrated. Actually, can we hear a clip in an educational song you may be familiar with?
One of these things is not like the others. One of these things doesn't belong. Can you tell which thing is not like the other by the time I finish this song?
One of these things is not like the others. It just doesn't belong. And, my colleague Kathy Ryan Starr says when she uses that song to explain the dynamics of belonging, it's important to mention we don't blame Sesame Street for this. It's this universally human phenomenon because it's about the way that our brains work. The social psychologist at Harvard, Mahzarin Banaji, she says that the mind is a difference-seeking machine. In her decades of research on how our brains perceive and handle difference, she concludes that the primary capacity of our brains is what helps us order and navigate the overwhelming complexity of reality. That this ability to categorize, to separate and know what's different, this is how we deal with just how wildly complex the world is. But of course, it's this same capacity that leads us to generalizations and stereotypes, to that term that Banaji popularized, implicit bias. In the survival systems that our brains developed long ago, sameness, familiarity is safe, is comfortable, is reassuring. Difference is risky, potentially dangerous, requires resource, our attention placed on it. So in many places, many contexts in our lives, we seek to belong by fitting in, and that kind of belongness, it's built on sameness, and it can allow us to keep our identities simple. In fact, sometimes it forces us to keep our identities simple and leave the rest of our lives at the door. It's the culture of many offices or workplaces, many schools, much of public life. My guess is that everybody here has some experience of being in a group where you felt you needed to leave some part of yourself at the door in order to belong. A friend of mine describes how when she goes and visits her conservative family, her extended family, she's aware that she checks more at the door than her muddy shoes and her jacket. She puts aside her radical queer and feminist politics, peels back her opinions on recent events, stuffed down feelings that have collected inside since the last time she saw those family members. She has to check a lot of who she is at the door in order to come in. So what I wonder is this: are there parts of yourself that you check at the door of this sanctuary in order to belong? Is that parking lot filled with more than cars when we gather together? You have been talking about and making commitments to widening the circle. We, as a Unitarian Universalist people, we are working our way in a decades-long journey towards widening the circle, towards being that beloved community that we know we could be, towards outliving King's diagnosis that this 11 a.m. hour on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in American society. And oftentimes I hear us, Unitarian Universalists, we struggle with this question like this. We say, I just wish, how can we get more of those people to come here? Have you heard people say that? And again, good intent, and there are important questions to ask about how do we welcome, and how do we make sure that we're not putting barriers up for people to come and feel a sense of belonging here. But I don't think it's the right starting point. I wonder this. Here's my theory. If we want to welcome a wider web of our human family, maybe we need to begin by welcoming parts of ourselves that we don't always trust can belong here. What are the cultural norms here? I wonder if you're actually willing in a moment to just shout a few of them out. See if you can come up with a word or a phrase that captures one of the norms, cultural norms, unique to us or reflective of a larger cultural norm that we inhabit in a word or a phrase. Will you yell some of those out? Casual church dress, inclusion. Silence. Intellectualism, being coupled. Neck up. Yeah. No sexuality. Oh yeah, our next sermon series is courageously corporeal, and we'll talk about that then. Okay. What else? What other cultural norms? Politeness and mutual respect. Progressive values. Thanks. I thought I heard oppressive values earlier, and no. Okay, progressive values. Yep. Honesty when possible. Higher education. Oh my gosh. That neck up place, right? Okay. Activism, musical values. Yes, a tradition. Listening, definitely. Living to our covenant. You know, I was thinking about the covenant, hearing a lot of your responses. We say this shortened version of our covenant every Sunday. We have a longer version that we talk about with members when they're new people who are joining and signing the book. I worry sometimes that when we say those words, what we're really saying is that we'll be nice, that we won't disagree in ways that make people feel uncomfortable, that we'll smooth things over. You know, we are, as Unitarian Universalists, we do reflect. We have a broad range of cultural identities in this room and in this community, but we inherit a waspy culture, right? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant tradition, right here. That's what made this place. And while we've been steadily and steadfastly and effortfully working on moving in a different direction for decades, that cultural DNA is strong. It does have that kind of highbrow attitude. And it manifests in so many ways in the life of our congregations, not just here, right? Tell me if I'm off the mark here, but I think that probably it's quite safe and easy among us to talk about something you heard on NPR or read maybe in the New Yorker. But if your interests run more along the lines of The Bachelorette, or if you're an avid reality TV fan and watched every season of Survivor, like some Unitarian Universalists I know. I wonder if you'd feel comfortable talking about that here. Or if your taste in music is more punk rock or pop or praise gospel, more than classical and maybe a little bit of folk and show tunes. Would you feel comfortable here? Would you feel like you belong? Or maybe there's just areas of your life, messy parts of ourselves that we feel like we have to check in the parking lot in order to fit in financial troubles or relationship troubles or challenges with addiction or mental health in your family. Or maybe it's about spirituality. Do you ever worry that your beliefs and practices, what you really believe and practice, would be misunderstood or not welcome if people really knew who you really are, what you really do? You know, it can be the case, and still is in many places, to be uncomfortable, that it's uncomfortable and unwelcome to declare oneself an atheist or a humanist. And though we have proudly held up humanism as a core strand of our tradition for generations now, we still have to be intentional about how we use our language, make sure that we're not exclusive, unwelcoming in our services. And at the same time, I regularly hear stories from Unitarian Universalists who feel uncomfortable sharing their theistic or spiritual beliefs in church, fearing they will be looked down on or mocked as irrational. And actually, I want to share a piece of a sermon that my colleague Marlon Lavenhar gave a few years ago in General Assembly, our big UU gathering up in Portland. He was talking about a big story that had happened at his church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This is our largest Unitarian Universalist congregation, and there's a story that you can actually watch as a movie about it on Netflix, and it's been documented in all sorts of ways, about Bishop Carlton Pearson, who was an black evangelical Pentecostal minister who discovered that he was a Universalist. And in discovering he was a Universalist, lost his denomination and his congregation. And the small community, it went from thousands to 300. They came with him to join All Souls, the Unitarian Universalist Church in Tulsa. And of course, as you can imagine, this community, this black Pentecostal community joining All Souls in Tulsa had an impact on a Unitarian Universalist church. And this is one of the things that happened. Marlon noticed this. Let's say, for instance, that I tell you I speak in tongues. Would you laugh at me and think I'm ridiculous? What if I believe in Jesus Christ as the incarnation of God, and I read the Bible as a way of deepening my understanding of myself and the world? Can I be a member of your church? Really, can I feel welcome? So what if I think God is real and prayer is powerful and ritual is effective? Would your church embrace me? Would you? Because our churches are based on the premise that there is no test of faith or belief, which allows us to have an incredible diversity of believers at the table, and yet I've seen the reactions, he says, some people get when they share certain beliefs in our congregations. And then he goes on to tell this story. He says, 3 months after All Souls welcomed the Pentecostal church, a long-time white member of the church walked into my office one day, and he's a staunch humanist, a lawyer, about 60 years old, and he says, Marlon, I want to tell you something that I would never have told anyone in this church and never have. I grew up Pentecostal, and to this day, I still speak in tongues. Marlon says, I tried not to look too surprised. Got minister face. But I was shocked. I asked how often. And he said probably about once or twice a week. He described it as a kind of meditation that allowed his mind to rest. And Marlon says, once I got over my initial disbelief and quietly checked my own prejudices, I was struck hardest by realizing this is a central part of his spiritual life. And he spent 30 years in our congregation and has never felt he could tell anyone in our church without being judged negatively, maybe even made to feel like an outsider. And he was right. So it makes me wonder, among us, even here, even now, what stories do we keep from telling? What parts of ourselves do we tuck away to ensure we will belong? I think there's a paradox here to safety and aliveness. We find that safety by making ourselves smaller and cutting off parts that we worry will make us vulnerable, keep us from belonging. And yet, that safety itself is so dangerous because it cuts us off from the aliveness that we all long for. That aliveness that Howard Thurman, Reverend Dr. King's mentor, spoke of when he said, and you've heard it before and you'll hear me say it again and again, don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive and go do that. Because what the world needs is more people who have come alive. Too much safety isn't good for us. I'm going to skip the vulnerability studies for now. We'll talk more about them another time. But I want to tell you to close about the Mosaic Project, where I formed my way of understanding how we build relationship and community across difference. The Mosaic Project is an outdoor school that gathers 4th and 5th graders from their classes together for a week of peace and diversity education using experiential education and a musical curriculum. 3 classes will come together from very different schools, a wealthy private school, an inner city school, something in between. They'll get mixed up in cabins for a week and taken through this curriculum. The idea is based on contact theory, that it's not just enough to be in contact with people who have differences than us, but that we actually have to talk explicitly about those differences. And so the curriculum guides them through having kids the very first day run across the circle and switch places, asking them, have you ever been asked to sit next to someone and you just knew they didn't want you to? Have you ever had that experience? And so we instead talk about the behaviors that show welcome. And then as a staff, we were intentionally modeling how to be a multicultural, multiracial team, working together, having each other's backs. And so we would start every week as a staff team, and with the high school cabin leaders who would help join us, we'd start by going around the circle and answering the question, if you really knew me, you would know. So I'd try and come up with something new every week. If you really knew me, you would know I won chess tournaments as a child. If you really knew me, you would know that even though everyone has always asked me what football position I play, I've never played football. If you really knew me, you would know that there were times when I was a teenager and I'd look at myself in the mirror and all I could think was monster. If you really knew me, you would know that some of the hardest moments in my life have been when I've lost touch with our consensus reality, when I've had a psychological breakdown, a psychosis that while I experienced it, felt like a spiritual awakening. If you really knew me, you would know that I love doing this with you and it terrifies me every week. So I want to invite you as we close to just take a moment to turn to someone near you, maybe a group of 2 or 3, and just take a second to go back and forth. If you can come up with a couple things to tell, maybe something that'll surprise. Doesn't have to be revealing a deep dark secret at your comfort level, but maybe something they don't know. If you really knew me, you would know. Would you just try that for a second? Find someone to tell around you in the pew. Good. Finish that last thought. All right, you can have these conversations more in coffee hour. You don't have to stop talking about this forever, just for now. Because I want to end you with a thought. I want to end this with one last thought, that we are here working together in these weird and hopefully beautiful ways. We are working on wrestling with these questions of racism and militarism and materialism. We are working towards building a peaceful, just, and beautiful world, and if we're going to build that multicultural, beloved community that we dream about, the welcoming, inclusive vision that we seek to embody, if we're going to make the peace in this world where our differences so often divide us, let's start with ourselves, with inviting one another to bring our whole selves all the way. Let's practice risking vulnerability and receiving that risk with warmth and with care. May it be so. Amen.